Ahead of the local elections, Labour have released a campaign video which features a very familiar face.
Here's what a Labour government can do for the people of Britain if it wins power. Before 1997, Britain had no minimum wage. For 100 years, people campaigned for one, we delivered it. Millions of pensioners and children were lifted out of acute poverty. School results increased dramatically across the board. Crime was cut by a third. NHS waiting lists slashed so that by the time we left office, NHS satisfaction levels were the highest they'd ever been since the NHS was created. We combined economic growth with social justice so that business prospered, and we had the resources to build new schools and new hospitals. Unemployment was low, employment high. We changed our country to make it more tolerant and more equal. Before 1997, gay people faced discrimination. No one black had ever served in a British cabinet. No Muslims in the House of Lords. Women in Parliament made up less than 10% of the members of Parliament. All of that changed, and changed to last, so that even Conservatives had to support the change. Peace was brought to Northern Ireland after decades of conflict. The Olympics was brought to London, a symbol of a new and different country at ease with itself. Britain became a world leader in aid and development. In these huge ways, and in a myriad of small ways, Britain was changed for the better. Because we cared enough to be disciplined enough to win. Because we finally understood that when we lose, the British people lose. Today, after 4 defeats, just as in 1997, we have new leadership and a renewed sense of purpose and mission. Keir Starmer has shown strength, determination, and intelligence in setting Labour back on a winning path. He knows a Labour Party true to its principles is a Labour Party dedicated to winning power, to change our country again for the better.
My. Barnaby, does that video with that phenomenal music in the background, does that make you inspired to go out and vote Labour this Thursday?
It will fail to inspire me, that video, which won't surprise you, Michael, but just who will it inspire? I mean, Blair talked about the importance of winning power. So what does the polling show? It shows 19% of people like him and 55% of people actively dislike him. So there's something very interesting going on here. The cry for electability, for speaking to the country, not just our narrow party base, is really nothing of the sort. It's a kind of 1990s dogma that believes that moderation means winning elections, with no account at all of the particular conditions of peace and prosperity in which that strategy worked, nor many answers for a world of inflation, falling living standards, climate and resource crises, and inter-imperialist conflict in which technocratic tinkering can't offer any answers. So I think it's very telling when people, and this happens across the left-right spectrum, right? When people live in the past because facing the present is just too difficult. Focus on the good old days, as Brecht famously put it, because we don't want to live in the bad new ones. It's really tragic how out of touch these people are with the scale of our challenges today, and their only hope is to win elections by default because the other lot are even more inept. But the important point here is that New Labour sowed the seeds of so many of our present miseries. This is a group of advisors around Keir Starmer who worship and adore the West Wing and Alistair Campbell and Peter Mandelson, who are slightly more competent centrist managers than they are. And so they want to give Tony Blair a free slot to rewrite his record. Well, the truth is, very interestingly published a couple of days ago by the Daily Telegraph, that right-wing newspaper, which had an article attacking New Labour, but praised New Labour on a few things. They said New Labour managed to hollow out the welfare state more efficiently than Thatcher and Major had managed. New Labour managed to take apart the architecture of the National Health Service with PFI, Private Finance Initiative, public-private partnerships. People should read Alison Pollock's amazing work, NHS PLC. And New Labour, of course, took apart comprehensive education with academisation. Initial benefit cuts for single mums was one of the first things that New Labour pushed in office to keep to Tory spending plans. And they did a kind of stealth redistribution through cash transfers like tax credits, which were very easily undone by a Tory government after 2010. They didn't change the structural makeup of a deindustrialised country with the City of London responsible for all our prosperity, which meant Britain was especially hard hit by the 2008 financial crisis. Other countries which were less reliant on private finance were less hard hit. Gordon Brown has celebrated the end of boom and bust and the city as answering all our problems. Meanwhile, New Labour ramped up authoritarianism, which we now policy on steroids from a Tory government with CCTV, ID cards, 90-day detention without trial was one proposal, all targeted especially against Muslims who became a kind of fifth column enemy within as part of the war on terror. Meanwhile, asylum seekers were battered and attacked to please the right-wing press. Refugees were pushed, a parliamentary select committee said, deliberately into destitution. That's the words of a parliamentary select committee when Tony Blair took away asylum seekers' right to work while they were seeking asylum. People fleeing some of the worst horrors in the world. Attacks on lefty lawyers from David Blunkett, a new Labour Home Secretary, trying to defend refugees. And the white working class, so-called, wasn't safe either. They were castigated as chavs in those new Labour years and targeted with ASBO's antisocial behaviour orders. Blair publicly mused cutting housing benefit from parents whose kids, he said, were misbehaving, potentially again pushing people into destitution. But the last thing to say here is that right now our politicians are united in their condemnation of Vladimir Putin. And some of them are saying, as I think, that he should be brought before an international tribunal. He should be brought before The Hague for war crimes. Vladimir Putin is guilty now of violating the sovereignty of an independent country, ignoring the UN Security Council, and so breaking international law. Anyone who says that can't be taken seriously if they have a video with someone who was also guilty of violating the sovereignty of an independent country, breaking international law, and killing up to 1 million people in Iraq. Tony Blair's a war criminal. He's responsible for so many of the damaging things of our contemporary politics, the drive towards authoritarianism, the attacks on racialized minorities, attacks on working class populations that gave us the Brexit vote. He's responsible for so many damages, including hollowing out the welfare state and privatizing the NHS. But he's also a war criminal, and for that, he should really never be forgiven.
Those are definitely the most significant reasons why Keir Starmer should not be trotting out Tony Blair, because of all those policy failures. And, the Iraq war is obviously a lot more than a policy failure. It's a war crime. But a problem with it as well is that it makes Keir Starmer look a bit shifty. Yes, the Blair endorsement came up in Keir Starmer's Sunday interview on Sky. Let's take a look.
I can't imagine you putting an endorsement video for Jeremy Corbyn up. You took the whip off him.
What I've said...
Why didn't you say at the time? Why weren't you honest to say, yeah, actually, I am more close to Tony Blair?
What I said at the time, what I've said consistently is the team now that we've got, or the leadership team that we've got...
You would answer the question now, wouldn't you? Are you closer to Tony Blair or Jeremy Corbyn?
Let me just tell you what I said at the time, which was, I'm not going to hug any previous Labour leader because I don't believe that you go backwards to go forward. I will learn from any Labour leader. I will talk with any Labour leader. And if it's Tony Blair who's won 3 elections, Gordon Brown who won it with them, then I'll happily take their advice and talk with them.
Talk to Jeremy Corbyn?
But I've never suggested that we... I think Tony actually, in that endorsement, or something he said yesterday, said we're not in the 1990s. We're actually got to face the future going forward. So it's the principles and approach that matter. But I spend my time talking to people who win because I want to win. I want to win because I want to change the lives of millions of people across the UK for the better.
You didn't tell me that in the leadership election, though, did you?
I think in the leadership election, I can't remember how many times in the leadership election, I said, I think I used this phrase, saying, I'm not going to have the name of some previous Labour leader tattooed on my forehead. I have to take this party forward, facing the challenge that we've got now.
Okay.
I'm not facing the challenges that Tony Blair faced a quarter of a century ago. I'm not facing the challenge that previous leaders faced. I'm facing the challenges of tomorrow, and I'm absolutely determined to not only change the Labour Party, but to change Britain in the work that we're doing.
He was so proud of that statement about not tattooing former leaders on his forehead that he's repeating it 2 years later. Very, very bizarre. In any case, that was Keir Starmer saying Labour needs to look forward, not backward. He didn't really explain what that would mean. Luckily for him, though, it's not just Labour who are out of new ideas. The Tories have also gone retro. This is from The Telegraph. Boris Johnson wants to give millions of people the right to buy the homes they rent from housing associations in a major shake-up inspired by Margaret Thatcher. The Prime Minister ordered officials to develop the plans in the last fortnight after becoming convinced the idea would help, quote, generation rent, The Telegraph can reveal. The proposal is intended to give the 2.5 million households in England who rent properties from housing associations the power to purchase their homes at a discounted price. It would be a new version of the famous Thatcher scheme that allowed families to buy properties from councils, one of the most well-known policies of her premiership. The Telegraph are right to buy was one of Thatcher's most well-known policies. It also had some of the worst long-term effects. 4 in every 10 homes which were sold by councils to tenants are now owned by private landlords. So we have exactly the same product as when the homes were owned by local authorities, except now rents are way more expensive and the cash flows to the wealthy instead of to the state. Barnaby, is the only thing worse than borrowing from Blair, borrowing from Thatcher?
Well, I think Thatcher, unlike Blair, was a kind of genius. And right to buy is one of the purest examples of that. It's the best example I know in modern British politics of what Antonio Gramsci, the great Italian Marxist, called a hegemonic strategy. It remakes the class map in your interests as the Tory party. Here's what it does, right to buy. It takes two problems of post-war Britain. Firstly, a large working class that includes people who clean schools and people who are head teachers in those schools, all of whom live next to each other in council housing and are therefore reliant on the state and are more likely to vote Labour and to identify with each other. And also the organisation of urban space, where large sections of inner cities, especially London, that key site of capital accumulation, is given over to working class housing. And these are two problems which, if you're going to redesign a neoliberal country, you want to avoid. So what do? Well, you don't just attack people and seize their housing from them and make them hate you. No, you do a right to buy policy, which says if you can put down a deposit, you can buy your home, sell it for much more, move out to the suburbs, become a suburban property owner, no longer a council tenant. And at the same time, Thatcher's privatizing industries. There's a Tell Sid campaign on TV. You can buy shares in private industries that you used to own, because everyone owned them when they were publicly owned. And you've moved then a section of what was the working class from being council house tenants to being property owning shareholders checking the stock prices in the Financial Times, and you've split them from that lower section of the working class, the people who can't afford the deposits, remain in council housing, and then you can attack those people, just as you've got a geographically and a racially differentiated attack where you're attacking black people in the cities, miners in the north. So you've split up the class map and won a section of what was the working class to your side, while also changing space, the organisation of space, because you've taken places like inner London, which were given over to large amounts of working class housing. And when the council tenants all realise they can make a lot of money by setting up in those spaces, you've cleared up the space for private redevelopment for offices and private homes. So it's a genius kind of policy, which I think the left should study as an example of a hegemonic strategy. It's a really clever and dastardly thing that Thatcher did. Its effects, long term, as with so much that she did, like the quick spending of North Sea oil revenue, were of course extremely damaging. We have a tiny and shrinking housing stock, partly because Thatcher put no obligation on councils to use the money they got from council house sales to build more. So it's very damaging, especially for working class people who need council housing. And most of us are now stuck in a private rented market with soaring rents that we can barely afford to pay. It didn't do any of us any good, but it won Thatcher some election victories, and it remade the British class map in her interests.
I think she banned councils from reinvesting it in council homes. I think that was one of the most sort of outrageous parts of it. This as well, actually going back to that New Labour discussion, I think on a domestic front, this is clearly their most obvious failure, right? And I always say this stat because I'm a little bit obsessed with it, but in my home borough, 1997, houses cost an average of 3 times someone's income. They now cost an average of 15 times someone's income. Now, most of that was under New Labour. New Labour massively oversaw the transition of our society from one based on production to one based on speculation and assets. Obviously, it was Thatcher who was the trailblazer. As you say, Barnaby, she was the genius, but Blair followed that path. And we live in that world today, unfortunately.